I still remember the autumn of 1997 when I agreed to spend a week watching over my uncle's farm in northern Missouri. He had gone south for a surgery and needed someone to stay there, to keep the place running and make sure no one tried to steal equipment from the sheds. It wasn't far from the Iowa line. Mostly corn and soy fields, scattered patches of trees, a couple of barns, and his cabin tucked back off a gravel road. The cabin was simple, built in the 60s, with one bedroom, a small kitchen, and a wide porch facing a line of fields that rolled on for miles. I was 22 at the time, broke, and didn't have much going on, so I said yes. I thought it would be easy: feed the cattle, check the fences, keep the wood stove burning at night. I brought a duffel bag, a few books, and a flashlight. I didn't know that week would leave me with images I'd never forget. The first couple of days were fine. I liked the quiet. The air was cold but not freezing, and the fields looked endless under the gray sky. At night, the only light came from the moon or the week bulb above the porch. Inside, the cabin smelled like old pine and would smoke. I'd sit by the fire, listen to the wind push against the walls, and fall asleep early. By the third night, I noticed something strange. Around midnight, I woke up, not from a sound, but from the feeling that I wasn't alone. I lay still, listening. The cabin made its usual creaks, but then I heard something faint outside, a crunch of gravel like someone stepping near the shed. I thought maybe it was a coyote or a stray dog, so I stayed in bed, but the sound lasted longer than it should have, like slow steps circling. I got up, grabbed the flashlight, and looked out the window. The beam caught nothing but the empty yard and the dark line of trees. I told myself it was just the wind moving loose boards on the shed. The next morning, though, I noticed fresh tracks in the dirt near the cabin. They weren't boots and they weren't paws either. They looked barefoot but too wide, the toes pressed deep into the soil. I stood there staring, trying to make sense of them. I thought maybe some kids had been messing around, though there weren't many houses nearby. I let it go and went about my chores. That night, I couldn't relax. Every time the wind rattled the shutters, I thought of those tracks. I kept the flashlight beside me in bed. Sometime after midnight, I heard the crunching again, slow and steady, this time closer to the porch. My throat felt dry, and I could hear my own heartbeat. I didn't get up right away. I just lay there, frozen. Then came a heavy, dragging sound, like something brushing against the wood steps. I forced myself up, turned on the light, and shined it out the window. Again, nothing. The yard looked empty, but in the dirt below the steps, I saw a darker patch, as if something wet had been dragged there. The following morning, I walked out to look. The dirt was scuffed, smeared, like someone had knelt there with mud on their legs. The marks went toward the tree line but disappeared before the field. I felt uneasy, but I kept telling myself it was probably just an animal. By the fifth day, my nerves were shot. I hadn't been sleeping well, and every little sound made me jump. I stopped going out after dark and kept the doors locked tight. Still, the noises didn't stop. Sometimes it was footsteps on gravel, sometimes scraping on the siding. Once, lying in bed, I thought I heard breathing outside my window. I didn't dare look. On the sixth night, things escalated. I just settled into bed when I heard it again, but this time much louder, more deliberate. Slow steps on the porch boards, one after another, heavy enough to make the floor groan. My mouth went dry. I grabbed the flashlight, aimed it at the window, and flicked it on. For half a second, I caught the shape of someone moving past the glass, too close, almost brushing against it. It was tall, thin, shoulders hunched, skin pale against the dark. Then it slipped out of sight. My hand shook so bad I dropped the light. I scrambled to pick it up and ran to the front door, shoving the deadbolt in place even though it was already locked. I stood there for what felt like hours, listening. The boards creaked once more, then silence. The next morning, when I opened the door, The porch boards had smeared prints on them. Bare feet, long toes pressed deep into the grain. I couldn't convince myself anymore that it was kids or an animal. Something had been right there, inches away from me while I slept. That day, I thought about leaving. My uncle would understand if I called it quits. But part of me felt stubborn, like I had to see it through. I tried to stay calm, kept busy, chopped firewood, and checked the cattle. The sky was overcast, heavy, and I felt watched the entire time I was outside. That night was the worst of all. I barricaded the door with a chair, kept the flashlight in one hand and a kitchen knife in the other. Around 1 a.m, the noises started again, first in the yard, then on the porch. Slow, dragging steps, then something new, scratching at the siding, just below the window, as if nails were dragging across the wood. My skin crawled. I wanted to call the sheriff, but the cabin phone line was dead. When I lifted the receiver, there was nothing but silence. I didn't have a cell phone back then, so I was cut off. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, then stopped. For a long stretch, there was only silence. I almost thought it had left. Then came the thud. Heavy, solid, against the front door. The chair rattled. My whole body went rigid. Another thud followed, harder, shaking the frame. Something was trying to push its way in. I stood frozen, gripping the knife, light trembling in my hand. Then, as suddenly as it started, the pounding stopped. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I just sat there, staring at the door, waiting. The first light, I opened it a crack. The yard was empty. On the porch, though, deep scratches gouged into the wood around the doorframe, like claws or fingernails digging to get inside. That was the last straw. I packed my bag, locked the cabin, and drove to the nearest town without looking back. I told my uncle I couldn't do it, that something was out there messing with me, and I wasn't staying another night. When he came back weeks later, he called me. He didn't laugh or make jokes. He said he believed me because he found the same marks I had described. Deep scratches on the door, smears in the dirt by the trees, footprints too big to belong to a child. He hired a man to put up stronger locks and bars on the windows, but he never figured out what or who had been out there. I never went back to that cabin again. Even now, years later, I still think about those nights. The sounds, the prints, the pale figure brushing past my window. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't anything supernatural. It was something flesh and blood that wanted to get inside. And the scariest part is knowing that it never did, not because it couldn't, but because, for some reason, it chose not to. It was late autumn of 1998, and I was 26 years old when I first stepped inside that old cabin. I had been driving through northern Arkansas, taking the back roads because I wanted to avoid the interstate traffic. My old Ford pickup had been acting up all week, stalling out every time I pushed it harder than 50. When I saw the gas gauge sitting lower than it should have been and realized I was 20 miles from the nearest town, I knew I had to stop somewhere. That was when I saw the cabin, tucked into the tree line off the narrow road, its roof sagging under years of neglect and the paint long gone. At first, I thought it was abandoned hunting property, one of those places men use once in a season and then let rot. But as I slowed down and pulled onto the dirt path that led up to it, I saw no tire tracks, no signs of recent human life. The grass around the driveway had grown knee-high, broken only by deer trails. Still, it was shelter, and I needed a place to wait out the night before risking the truck again. The closer I got, the more uneasy I felt. The cabin's front porch leaned to the left, boards warped from rain and frost. One shutter clung to a single hinge while the other lay broken on the ground. The windows were streaked with dirt so thick you couldn't see inside, and the door hung open just a crack, wide enough to show darkness waiting beyond. I parked just a few feet away, killed the engine, and sat in silence for a moment, listening to the ticking of the truck cooling down. The woods pressed in from all sides, the branches bare and rattling in the wind. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out, the gravel crunching loud under my boots. My first instinct was to check around the cabin, make sure nobody was inside. Even an old place like this could attract drifters. Walking around the side, I saw where animals had been chewing through the siding, and I caught the strong smell of rot and damp wood. The back door was worse than the front, half collapsed and hanging by nails. Beyond it, the kitchen looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Rusted pots sat on a counter, and the remains of a chair leaned against the wall, as if someone had kicked it over years ago. I stepped back around to the porch, testing the boards with my weight. They groaned under me but held. The door swung open with barely a push, and I aimed my flashlight into the dark interior. Dust floated in the beam like snow. The living room stretched out in front of me, empty except for a broken sofa frame and a few glass bottles on the floor. The smell of mildew and something sour lingered, strong enough to make me breathe through my mouth. I went in slowly, the floorboards creaking loud under every step. My flashlight caught details that made my stomach tighten. A coat left draped over a nail, so eaten away by moths it looked like lace. A cracked mirror leaning against the wall with a long streak of what might have been dried mud across it. I kept moving, telling myself it was all just old junk. In the back room, I found what must have been a bedroom. The mattress lay on the floor, black with mold. The walls were covered with stains from water leaks. And then I noticed the closet door. Unlike everything else in the cabin, it was shut tight, almost too neat. I stared at it, listening. Nothing. No movement. But I didn't want to open it. Something about it bothered me, though I couldn't explain why. Instead, I returned to the living room and set my flashlight on the windowsill, letting it light the room while I sat on the floor with my back against the wall. I ate a sandwich I had packed earlier, chewing slowly, every crunch of bread sounding too loud in the empty space. The woods outside were dead quiet now. Not a single insect or bird made a sound. Hours dragged. My watch said it was just after 11 when I thought I heard something outside. Not a deer or raccoon, this was heavier. Slow steps moving in the leaves. I froze, straining to hear through the cabin walls. The steps circled to the back, then silence. I told myself it was probably nothing, maybe my imagination mixing with the wind, but I couldn't shake the unease crawling up my spine. I decided I wasn't going to sleep. I sat there in the dark, my flashlight beam growing weaker as the battery drained. Around midnight, the wind picked up hard, rattling the loose boards and sending a high whistling sound through the cracks. And then, from the bedroom, I heard a noise, a soft thud, like something had shifted inside. Every muscle in my body tightened. I slowly reached for the crowbar I kept behind the truck seat and had carried in with me. I held it in my lap and stared at the hallway. The sound came again, clearer now, a dragging shuffle. The bedroom had been empty when I checked, except for the closet. I forced myself to move. My heart slammed in my chest as I walked toward the back. The flashlight was dim now, barely strong enough to push back the dark, but I aimed it into the bedroom. The mattress was still there, the stains on the walls the same. But the closet door was cracked open. Not wide, just an inch or two, enough to show blackness inside. I stood there for a long time, crowbar raised, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. Finally, I stepped closer, slow, my boots crunching on broken plaster. I shoved the closet door open with the end of the crowbar, my breath caught in my throat. The beam of light showed a small space, just wooden walls and an old coat hanger. Empty, but the floor told a different story. The dust inside had been disturbed, scuffed by something recently. And near the back corner, where the wall met the floor, was a hole. A jagged, splintered opening leading into darkness beneath the cabin. The smell hit me then, strong, foul, the unmistakable stench of something dead and rotting. I stepped back fast, my stomach turning. Whatever had been in there wasn't an animal nest. The scuff marks looked too large, too deliberate. Someone had been crawling in and out. I didn't wait to see more. I turned and went straight for the front door, grabbed my flashlight, and stumbled out onto the porch. My truck sat there in the dark, a shape against the trees, and I sprinted for it, gravel spraying under my boots. I jumped in, slammed the door, and twisted the key. The engine coughed, sputtered, then finally roared alive. As I pulled out, my headlights swept across the cabin one last time. For a split second, I saw movement, not in the windows, but at the side of the cabin near the back. A figure low to the ground, retreating fast into the woods. My stomach dropped. Someone had been living under that cabin, hiding there maybe for years. I didn't stop until I hit the highway, driving blind with the gas gauge nearly empty. I made it to a small town just past 2 in the morning and parked outside a gas station that was closed until dawn. I didn't sleep. I sat there gripping the wheel, the image of that cracked closet door stuck in my head, the smell still clinging to my clothes. The cabin had been abandoned, yes, but not empty. Someone had carved out a place beneath it, crawling in and out through the floor, waiting, watching. I had walked right into their space without knowing it. And I knew if I had stayed the night, if I had tried to sleep on that rotten floor, I might not have woken up at all. I never drove that road again. I had been working as a seasonal park ranger for only a few months when they assigned me to an older cabin on the edge of the state park. It was the fall of 1997, and the forest around northern Montana was already changing colors. The air had that sharp edge to it, like every breath was a reminder that winter was coming fast. The cabin itself wasn't much, just a squat wooden structure with one bedroom, a small kitchen, and a wood stove that smoked more than it heated. It sat about 6 miles from the nearest service road, tucked into the trees near a narrow river that carried the meltwater from the mountains. Most rangers preferred to be closer to the main lodge, but I didn't mind the isolation. At 29, I figured I could handle being alone for stretches. The solitude even felt right, but I started noticing things almost as soon as I moved in. At first, it was small details, things I brushed off. A shovel leaning against the wrong wall outside, footprints pressed into the mud near the steps when I hadn't seen anyone come through, the faint sound of branches snapping late at night. I tried to tell myself the forest makes noises, that animals wander through, that sometimes wind carries things in strange ways. I'd grown up hunting in these same kinds of woods. Still, it was hard to ignore the pattern. Every time I returned from patrol, something seemed off. The cabin door had 2 locks, one old metal latch and a newer padlock. I used both, but twice I came back to find the latch not fastened. Nothing was missing, but small things inside the cabin were different. The lamp on the table turned slightly. The coffee tin shifted to the other side of the counter. One of my notebooks left open when I was sure I had closed it. I kept telling myself it was me, that I was tired, that maybe I was careless. But that excuse wore thin. I started checking the windows every night. There were 4 of them, 2 small ones in the bedroom, one by the stove and one by the door. They were old glass panes, easy to jimmy open if someone wanted to. I hammered nails into the frames so they couldn't slide without breaking. That gave me a little peace of mind, at least until the night it rained. It was one of those heavy downpours that hits out of nowhere, the kind that hammers the roof and turns the yard into mud within minutes. The sound of water rushing off the eaves made it impossible to sleep. I lay there in the dark listening, every creak of the wood louder than usual. Sometime around 2 in the morning, I heard something different, something deliberate. Not the rain, not the wind. It was the sound of gravel crunching under weight, slow and heavy, like someone stepping near the cabin. I held my breath. The sound came again, closer this time. I sat up on the cot, heart thudding, straining to hear through the storm. Then it went quiet. For 10, maybe 15 minutes, I stayed frozen, staring at the window. Finally, I forced myself to get up, pulled on my boots, and grabbed the flashlight I kept by the stove. I opened the door and shined the beam across the yard. Nothing, just sheets of rain and mud. But the ground told a different story. Right there in the mud, plain as day, were boot prints. Not mine. Bigger, wider, pressed deep into the earth from the weight. They led from the tree line straight toward the cabin, stopped about 5 feet from the steps, then turned back into the woods. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. The next day, I hiked to the ranger station 10 miles south and told my supervisor. He shrugged, said hunters sometimes cut through, maybe got curious. He reminded me the park wasn't fenced. That answer didn't sit well with me, but I didn't push it. For the next week, I barely left the cabin except to make short patrols. I started keeping a hatchet close, not because I thought it would save me, but because I couldn't stand the idea of being empty-handed if someone came back. Nothing happened for a few days, and I convinced myself maybe it really had just been a hunter passing through. Then came another storm. It was colder this time, the kind of rain that feels half like sleet, stinging your skin. The river swelled and roared so loud it shook the ground. I lit the lantern, sat by the stove, and tried to write in my notebook just to pass the time. Around midnight, the lantern flickered. I leaned over to adjust it, and that's when I heard the sound again. Not outside this time, inside. It was faint, but clear enough over the rain. A soft scrape, like wood against wood. My stomach dropped. I froze, listening hard, and then I heard it again from the far corner of the cabin, near the storage closet. I stood, flashlight in one hand, hatchet in the other, and edged toward the sound. The closet door was shut. I hadn't opened it in days, and there was nothing in there but old supplies left behind by other rangers. Empty crates, a broken lantern, a coil of rope. I put my hand on the latch, counted to 3 in my head, and yanked it open. Empty. I swept the beam of my flashlight across the shelves. Nothing had moved. No animals. No sign of anyone hiding. I shut the door, but my nerves were shot. I sat up the rest of the night again, listening to every sound until the storm passed. The next morning, I checked the cabin from top to bottom. That's when I found it. Behind the stove, tucked low against the wall, was a thin strip of torn fabric caught on a nail. Dark blue like from a jacket. It hadn't been there before. I stared at it for a long time, trying to understand how it got there. The only way was if someone had squeezed behind the stove. The space was barely wide enough, but it was possible. That day, I hiked the whole perimeter of the cabin, checking the mud and leaves. I found more boot prints leading around the back, some fresher than others. They circled wide, stopped at different windows, then disappeared into the forest. I should have left right then. I knew it, but pride and stubbornness kept me. I told myself I could handle it, that I'd finish my assignment. I stacked extra firewood, sharpened the hatchet, and even rigged up a crude alarm. Empty tin cans strung on fishing line around the cabin, so anything moving close would make noise. It was only 2 nights later when they went off. The sharp clatter of cans jolted me upright. The lantern was still burning, and I saw the shadow move past the front window. Someone was outside, circling. The cans rattled again near the back wall. Then silence. I sat there gripping the hatchet so hard my hand cramped. Minutes stretched like hours. Finally, I heard retreating steps, fading into the trees. I waited until morning before stepping outside. The ground was a mess of footprints. They'd come from the east side, walked a full circle around the cabin, then vanished into the woods again. Whoever it was knew I was inside. They tested the perimeter, checked my defenses, and walked away. That was the last night I spent there. At first light, I packed everything I could carry: food, water, notebook, hatchet, and left the rest behind. I didn't even bother locking the door. I hiked straight to the ranger station without stopping, ignoring the weight of my pack and the ache in my legs. When I told my supervisor what had happened, he looked uneasy. He didn't laugh this time. He admitted there'd been other reports over the years, unsettling ones, but nothing ever proven. Hunters complaining of being followed, campers hearing footsteps outside their tents at night, signs of people moving through the woods without a trace. They pulled me from that cabin assignment the same day. A week later, when another ranger went to check it, he found the door wide open, the cans torn down, and fresh footprints inside the cabin itself. I never went back. Even now, almost 30 years later, I think about those nights in that cabin. I still see the boot prints filling with rainwater, the fabric caught on the nail, the shadow sliding across the window. Whoever it was out there, they weren't lost and they weren't passing through. They knew exactly where I was. They wanted me to know I wasn't alone. And the scariest part is, I'll never know why they left me alive. I was 26 when I decided to build my own cabin on a small piece of land I had bought in northern Minnesota. It was the fall of 1998, and I had taken a week off from the warehouse job I had in town. I wanted a place to escape on weekends, somewhere away from people and noise. The land I bought wasn't big, just a couple of acres by a quiet back road, surrounded by thick pine and birch. No neighbors, no power lines, just trees and dirt. I had been hauling lumber up there with my old Chevy pickup, stacking the boards in piles and covering them with tarps. The cabin wasn't going to be anything fancy, just a single room with a small porch. I had measured out the foundation and started digging earlier that week. By the time Friday rolled around, the frame was already standing. I planned to finish the walls and maybe get the roof on before heading back to town on Sunday night. That Friday evening, the weather turned bad. The sky had been gray all day, heavy with clouds, and by the time I nailed the last board of the west wall, the rain came down hard. Cold autumn rain, the kind that soaks you through in minutes. I had no choice but to stop working. The ground turned to mud around the cabin site, and water dripped from the brim of my cap as I carried my tools to the little plastic shed I had set up to store them. I decided to stay the night anyway. I had an old canvas tent and a sleeping bag, and I figured I could wait out the storm. The sound of rain on the tent wasn't new to me. I'd camped plenty of times before, but something about that night was different. Maybe it was the way the forest seemed to press in, darker than usual, the way the wind moaned through the trees like a low whistle. I tried not to think too much of it. The tent was pitched about 20 yards from the cabin frame, just far enough that I could see the dark outline of the structure when the lightning flashed. I lit a small lantern, ate a sandwich I had packed, and then stretched out in my sleeping bag. The rain kept beating on the canvas, steady and hard. I told myself I'd sleep through it, but I didn't. Around midnight, I woke up, not from the rain, but from a noise outside the tent. At first I thought it was just the wind shifting branches, but then I heard it again, sharp, deliberate, like boots in mud. My heart kicked up fast. I lay still, holding my breath, trying to listen through the storm. Another step, then another. Slow, heavy, not far from the tent. I wasn't supposed to have anyone around. Nobody even knew I was staying out there, except my brother back in town. The land was mine, bought legally, and the nearest house was miles down the road. Still, I couldn't shake the thought that maybe someone was wandering through the woods. Maybe a hunter who got lost. Maybe some drifter. I wished I had locked the tool shed, but I hadn't. I reached for the small hatchet I kept next to my bag. My hand gripped the wooden handle so tight my knuckles ached. I lay there listening as the steps moved closer, circling the tent. The rain masked most of the sound, but every few seconds I caught the squelch of mud underfoot. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry. Lightning lit up the sky, and for a split second, through the thin canvas, I saw a shadow move. The figure, tall, no umbrella, no flashlight, just standing there. Then darkness again. My chest tightened. I didn't breathe for what felt like a full minute. The steps didn't stop until they moved away, fading toward the direction of the cabin frame. I waited, still as a rock, rain dripping through tiny seams in the tent, soaking into my blanket. My ears strained for more, but the storm swallowed everything. I don't know how long I stayed like that, 10 minutes, maybe 30. When I finally sat up, my body was stiff and cold. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. Rain hit my face, and the lantern glow spilled weakly onto the mud. Nothing moved. The cabin frame stood in the distance, black against black. I thought about staying in the tent, but the idea of lying there blind, listening, was worse. I decided to check the site. Every step felt like walking on glass. The mud sucked at my boots, and water poured off the brim of my cap. I held the hatchet low, close to my leg. When I reached the cabin frame, I stopped. My eyes adjusted just enough to make out the shape of the lumber, the gaps where the roof would be. Nothing seemed out of place at first, but then I noticed footprints in the mud. They weren't mine. Too big, spaced too far apart. Fresh, deep from the weight. They circled the frame, then disappeared back into the tree line. I followed with my eyes, but the forest was just a wall of darkness. No movement, no sound except rain. I stood there for a long time, water running down my back, my grip tight on the hatchet. Whoever it was, they had been watching me, maybe even earlier in the day while I worked. My stomach turned at the thought. Finally, I went back to the tent, but I didn't sleep. I sat with the lantern off, listening, every muscle tense. The night dragged on hour by hour. I didn't hear the footsteps again, but I knew I wouldn't make it to morning without doing something. As soon as the first gray light came through the clouds, I packed up. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and mist clung to the trees. My tent was soaked, my clothes heavy, but I didn't care. I threw everything in the truck bed and slammed the tailgate shut. I didn't even look back at the cabin frame. On the way out, the tires slipped in the mud, spraying dirt as I gunned it down the narrow road. My hands shook on the wheel, and I didn't stop until I hit the main highway. For the next few weeks, I didn't go back. The thought of those footsteps, the size of those prints, the shadow outside my tent, it stuck with me. I told myself maybe it was just a hunter, maybe someone passing through who didn't mean harm. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. Hunters carry flashlights. Strangers lost in the woods call out. Whoever was there didn't want to be seen. When I finally did return, it was in broad daylight with my brother along for company. We walked the site together. The cabin frame was still standing, tools untouched, nothing stolen. But in the mud near the tree line, where the ground stayed damp, I found one last print. It was older now, edges softened by rain, but still there, still bigger than my boot, facing the cabin. That night I decided I wouldn't camp out there again, not alone. I finished building the cabin during the day, always leaving before dark, always keeping a rifle close by. When it was finally done, I used it only as a weekend place, never sleeping more than one night at a time. Even now, years later, when I sit on that porch and the rain comes down hard, I remember that night. I think about the shadow moving outside my tent, the sound of boots in the mud, and how close they came to me. I know the woods are full of animals, full of sounds that play tricks on you. But I also know what I heard and what I saw, and I know someone was out there watching. I hadn't been down that road in years. Not since the divorce, not since I left everything behind and moved 2 towns over just to get away from the sight of it all. But yesterday, after nearly a decade, I found myself driving through that same stretch of woods on the north side of Vermont, the road that wound up past the river and into the darker hills. It wasn't where I wanted to be. I was just taking a shortcut after a long day's drive, trying to shave off an hour before nightfall. The air was heavy with late September dampness, the kind that seeps into your jacket and lingers on your skin, and the clouds were thick, pressing down over the ridges. I thought I had prepared myself. I knew the road would eventually bring me close to her cabin. My ex-wife's cabin. Not ours. Hers. After the divorce, she kept it, and though I tried not to think about it, the place still carried every heavy memory that sat on my chest at night when I struggled to sleep. That cabin was where we fought, where we screamed at each other until our throats were raw, where she once threw a plate at the wall and it shattered inches from my head. It was where I realized I couldn't stay anymore. But seeing it after all these years was different than remembering it. The trees thinned as I rounded the bend, and there it was on the right, about 100 feet off the dirt road, tucked between 2 tall pines. The siding was darker now, weather-beaten and stained from years of neglect. The tin roof was streaked with rust, and the porch sagged just slightly, like the whole place was slowly giving up. There were no lights, no car out front, no sound. Just stillness. It sat there like something forgotten, something that should have been buried but wasn't. I slowed down without even meaning to, my hands tightening on the steering wheel. The gravel crunched under my tires. I told myself I was just curious. I wanted to see how bad it had gotten, if anyone was even living there anymore. But the truth is, something else was pulling me. Something about that cabin had always made my stomach knot, even when we first bought it. Back then, it was supposed to be an escape, a place to fix things between us. But it never worked. Instead, every fight got worse there. Every silence felt heavier. I pulled over onto the side of the road. My heart was beating harder than it should have been. I wasn't planning on getting out, but I did anyway. My boots sank into the soft shoulder of the dirt road, wet from the recent rain. The air smelled like pine needles and rot. I glanced up and down the road, empty, no headlights in either direction. The path leading up to the cabin was half swallowed by weeds and fallen branches. It looked like no one had walked it in years. Each step felt louder than it should have been, twigs snapping under my weight, leaves crunching. The closer I got, the heavier the air felt, like the woods themselves were pressing in tighter around me. The porch groaned when I stepped onto it, boards bending under my weight. I looked at the front door. The paint was chipped away, exposing bare wood underneath. The old lock was still there, the same one I used to slide a key into late at night when we came back from town after drinking too much. But now the door sat slightly ajar, just enough to notice. I froze. That door was never easy to open. You had to yank it hard because the frame had warped. It wouldn't just blow open. I should have turned back right then. But I pushed it open with my hand, slowly, the hinges shrieking like a wounded animal. Inside was dark, and it smelled of mildew, damp wood, and something else. Something sharp, metallic. I stepped in. The floor was littered with dirt and leaves, like the place had been left open for the forest to creep inside. Dust floated in the weak gray light coming through the windows. The living room looked smaller than I remembered. The couch was still there, sagging, covered in a sheet of grime. The old stone fireplace was blackened, as if someone had burned too much wood in it without cleaning. And then I noticed the back wall. Scratches, deep gouges in the wood paneling low to the ground. They weren't there before. Long lines carved into the boards, some overlapping, some curling upward. I crouched down and ran my hand over them. The wood fibers splintered under my touch. They weren't old. My stomach churned. I stood up too fast, bumping my head against the edge of the mantel. The metallic smell was stronger now. It led me toward the kitchen. I stepped carefully, the boards creaking under my weight. The kitchen window was cracked, the glass broken inward, shards still on the counter. The refrigerator door hung open, empty inside. But what made my chest tighten was the sink. It was stained dark, brownish red streaks down the basin, dried and hardened. I backed up, my breath coming quicker, the hair on my arms standing up. I tried to tell myself it could have been anything, rust maybe, but I knew what rust looked like. I'd seen it 1,000 times on old tools and pipes. This wasn't rust. I turned toward the hallway, the narrow passage that led to the bedroom we used to share. The carpet was damp, squishing under my boots. The door at the end was shut. Something inside me screamed to leave, to get back to my car and drive until I couldn't see the cabin in the rear view anymore. But I couldn't make myself move. I stared at that door until my eyes watered. Then I heard it, a soft thump, not from outside, from inside the bedroom. My body locked up. Every muscle went rigid. The sound came again, heavier this time, like something shifting against the floor. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I just stood there, heart hammering so loud I thought it would burst through my chest. And then silence. The kind of silence that isn't really silent, but thick, pressing against your ears. I stepped backward, slowly, careful not to make the floor creak. I didn't take my eyes off that door. My throat was dry, and my palms were slick with sweat. I backed all the way to the living room, then to the porch, and then I was outside again, the air hitting me like cold water. I didn't run. I walked fast, forcing myself not to look back. When I reached my car, my hands were shaking so bad I dropped the keys twice before I got them in the ignition. As I drove off, gravel spitting from my tires, I looked in the rearview mirror one last time. The cabin sat there, dark, still, half hidden by the trees. Nothing moved, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone had been in that bedroom, standing just on the other side of that door, waiting. I didn't stop driving until I was back on the main highway, lights from the next town glowing in the distance. My chest slowly loosened, but the smell, the metallic tang that clung to the air inside that cabin, stayed with me. I know I'll never go back down that road again. Whatever is inside that place now, it's not mine to know. But I'll carry the weight of it forever. The image of those scratches in the wall, the stains in the sink, and the sound. Those two heavy thumps that told me clear as day that the cabin wasn't as empty as it looked. I grew up not knowing much about what my mom really did for work. She always said she worked for the government and left it at that. She was gone often, sometimes for weeks, and when she came back she carried herself like she was always looking over her shoulder. She wasn't the type to explain things to me, but as I got older, pieces started to make sense. She was a Crown agent, one of those people who worked quietly behind the scenes, handling things most people would rather not know about. When I was in my early 20s, around 2009, she told me I needed to go with her on a trip. She didn't ask me, she just told me. We drove from the city, heading north through long stretches of empty highway, past thick forests and hills that looked untouched. The road narrowed until it was barely wide enough for 2 cars. I kept asking where we were going, but she ignored me, staring straight ahead, her hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual. We ended up at a cabin. It was in Ontario, tucked so deep into the woods you wouldn't know it was there unless you were led to it. The wood on the outside was dark, damp from years of rain, and the metal roof was spotted with rust. It looked like no one had lived there in decades, but the path leading up to it was fresh, as if it had been swept clean or maybe just heavily used recently. My mom pulled the car up close to the trees instead of in front of the cabin, which felt odd to me at the time. She cut the engine, grabbed a heavy black duffel bag from the trunk, and started walking without a word. Inside the cabin, the air was stale, smelling of old pine and damp clothes. The floor creaked with every step. There were no pictures, no personal items, just bare furniture. A wooden table, 2 chairs, a small bed in the corner. It was too empty, too deliberate, like the kind of place someone would use just for hiding, not living. That night, rain started tapping against the roof, soft at first, then harder. I sat at the table while my mom unpacked the duffel bag. There were files, a gun, and stacks of papers sealed in folders. She spread them out with a kind of focus that made me feel like I wasn't supposed to be looking, so I stared at the wood knots in the table instead. The hours dragged. I tried to sleep on the small bed, but the sounds outside kept me awake. The shifting of trees in the wind, branches snapping in the dark, and once, what sounded like footsteps crunching wet ground. I told myself it was just the rain hitting leaves, but deep down I knew it wasn't. Around midnight, I heard movement outside again. This time it was closer, heavier. I froze. My mom was still at the table, flipping through pages, her face lit by a single dim lantern. Without looking at me, she slid the gun across the table to her side, slow and quiet. She didn't say anything, but the way she moved told me she heard it too. The noise stopped. The woods went silent, even the rain easing into a drizzle. That silence pressed on me harder than the noise had. After a few minutes, she stood, went to the window, and moved the curtain just enough to see out. She stayed there for a long time, then finally sat back down. Her shoulders were tense, her hand resting on the gun the whole time. I didn't sleep. I just lay on the bed, staring at the dark ceiling, counting every sound. Around 3 in the morning, I dozed off. I woke to the faint smell of smoke. At first I thought it was the lantern, but the lantern was off. My mom was already standing by the door, gun in her hand. She opened it slowly, and that's when I smelled its stronger, burning wood, faint but there. She stepped out, and I followed, my chest tight. The air outside was cold and damp, but the smell of smoke lingered, drifting from somewhere deeper in the trees. We stood still, listening. Then we heard it, branches cracking, heavy footsteps moving fast, away from us. My mom stayed frozen for a moment, then went back inside. She didn't chase it, didn't say anything. She just shoved the papers into the duffel bag, zipped it up, and told me with her eyes that we were leaving. We left before the sun came up. The car was damp from the rain, the windshield fogging as she drove fast down the narrow road. I kept looking behind us, expecting to see someone coming out of the woods, but there was nothing, just the empty trees fading in the rearview mirror. I thought we were done with that place, but a week later she told me we had to go back. She said nothing else, only that it wasn't safe to leave things unfinished. This time I felt a pit in my stomach the whole ride. When we got there, the cabin looked different. The front door was open a crack, the lock busted. My mom pushed it open with her foot, gun raised. Inside, the table was flipped, papers scattered everywhere, and deep muddy boot prints tracked across the floor. Whoever had been outside that night had come back. We searched the cabin. The bed was torn open, stuffing everywhere, like someone thought something was hidden inside. The lantern was gone, and one of the chairs was broken in half. My mom's face was pale but hard. She didn't say anything. She picked up the folders, flipping through them quickly, checking what was missing. There were tire tracks outside, leading away from the cabin, fresh in the mud. Whoever had been there had left not long before we arrived. My mom followed them a few yards before stopping, staring into the distance like she knew chasing wasn't an option. We spent the rest of the day in silence, picking up the mess. I kept asking myself who those people were, why they had been there, why my mom had chosen this cabin in the first place. The uneasiness didn't fade. It only grew. Every creak of the wood, every shift of wind against the walls made me flinch. By the time night fell, we had everything packed again. My mom sat at the table with the gun beside her, waiting. I lay on the bed, unable to close my eyes. I heard it again, sometime after midnight. Those footsteps outside, slower this time, circling the cabin. My chest pounded so hard I thought they could hear it. My mom stayed still, watching the door, her hands steady on the gun. The steps stopped right at the front. The floorboards creaked under my weight as I shifted, and whoever was outside moved suddenly, crashing through the brush, running into the dark. That was the breaking point. At dawn, we left for good. My mom never explained who they were or why they wanted what she had. All she told me was that the cabin was burned down weeks later, reduced to ash, nothing left standing. I never saw the place again. What stayed with me wasn't just the fear of that night, but the realization of how much she had kept from me. The life she lived wasn't safe, and it wasn't something she could ever really leave behind. I understood then why she never talked about her work, why she always kept me at arm's length. That cabin wasn't just a place in the woods. It was a reminder that danger follows people who deal with the things others pretend don't exist. And I had been pulled into it even for just a few nights. The smell of damp pine, the sound of those footsteps in the dark, the silence of the woods pressing in. I can still feel it all if I think too hard. I never asked her again about her work. I didn't want the answers. I drove out to the cabin in the fall of 1997, somewhere in the forests of northern Maine. I was 32 at the time, old enough to know better but still stubborn enough to test myself. The cabin had belonged to a man I barely knew, a distant uncle who'd left it behind after he died. It was old, half-rotted, built in the 1950s, and I had only seen it once before as a kid. Back then, it seemed like some hidden treasure buried in the trees. This time, when I pulled up the dirt path and saw it again, it looked different, shrunk, tired, and almost leaning into the woods. The air had that sharp bite of late October. The leaves were nearly gone, the trees standing like black skeletons against the gray sky. My car struggled on the last stretch of the road, mud pulling at the tires, and when I finally parked, the silence pressed in on me. It wasn't the comfortable kind of silence. It was the kind where every crack in the woods made me lift my head. The cabin itself was small, one room with a loft above. The front porch sagged. I remember running my hand along the railing and pulling back with a splinter stuck deep in my finger. The wood smelled like damp earth and mildew. Inside, it was even rougher than I expected. Dust thick on the counter, mice droppings in the corners, a cracked window that let in a sliver of cold air. There was no electricity, no running water, just an old iron stove and a cot. I had brought food, a lantern, and a small gas heater. I thought I was prepared. That first night, I lay on the cot listening to the forest press against the cabin. The wood creaked like footsteps. I could hear scratching in the walls, mice, I told myself. Outside, branches snapped under weight I pretended was deer. Every sound echoed longer than it should have. I hardly slept, and when I did, I dreamed of doors I couldn't lock and windows without glass. By the second day, I tried to shake it off. I hiked the nearby trail, gathered wood, and forced myself to settle in. The air was so still that when I stopped walking, it felt like the whole forest was holding its breath. I found old beer cans scattered in the brush, rusty and shot through with holes. Someone had used them for target practice a long time ago. That detail stuck with me, though I didn't know why. That night, the quiet grew heavier. The scratching in the walls was worse, and I could hear movement under the floorboards, like something crawling. Around midnight, I woke up sweating even though the room was cold. The lantern had gone out. I struck a match, and the flare of light made the shadows bend and twist. The stove had gone cold. I forced myself out of bed, fed it wood, and sat there staring at the orange glow until I couldn't keep my eyes open anymore. On the third day, I noticed things were off. My axe wasn't where I left it. I had leaned it by the porch rail, but in the morning it was stuck into a stump 10 feet away. I told myself maybe I had forgotten, maybe I had done it tired. Later, I found one of my food cans dented, not opened, just crushed in the middle like someone had pressed it with strong hands. I thought of bears, but the can was inside the cabin when I unpacked. Bears don't open doors. I tried to brush it off, but as the sun dipped low, unease settled in my chest like a weight. I locked the door that night, sliding the iron latch across. I kept the lantern burning and sat with my back to the wall. Hours passed, the stove crackled, and I must have dozed. When I woke, the lantern was out again. I reached for the matches but stopped. I could hear breathing, not my own. Slow, steady, deep breaths, coming from the far corner of the room. I froze. My hand shook so bad I couldn't even strike the match. My eyes adjusted to the dark, and the shadows thickened, but I couldn't see anything clear. I stayed still until my legs cramped. Eventually, I forced myself up and lit the lantern. The cabin was empty, nothing in the corner but my pack. I told myself it had been my imagination, just the sound of the stove or wind through the cracks. But the hairs on my arms stayed raised. By the fourth morning, I had decided I would leave. I packed quick, barely eating. But when I opened the cabin door, the first thing I saw were footprints in the mud. Bare feet, large, wide, pressed deep into the ground. They circled the cabin. The prints were fresh. I felt my throat tighten and a sour taste rose in my mouth. I had locked that door all night. Whoever it was had been out there while I lay inside. I stuffed the rest of my things into the bag and loaded the car. I didn't even look back at the cabin. The dirt road was slick from rain the night before, and I drove slow, checking the rearview mirror every other second. The trees leaned over the road, branches clawing at the car. My hands hurt from gripping the wheel so tight. When I reached the highway, I didn't stop until I was 2 towns away. I pulled into a gas station, hands shaking as I filled the tank. I told myself I would never go back there, and I didn't. A month later, out of restless curiosity, I asked a local about the land. The man looked at me for a long time before answering. He said the cabin had always been trouble. Hunters used it sometimes, but nobody stayed long. People had seen strange men wandering the woods out there. Men who didn't belong to any nearby town. Men who wouldn't answer when called to. Some thought they lived wild, off the land, avoiding everyone else. That explained enough for me. Whoever had been outside that cabin, whoever had been close enough to leave those bare prints in the mud. They weren't a ghost, they weren't some story. They were real, flesh and blood, and they had been watching me while I slept inside. I sold the cabin that winter. I didn't care what it was worth. I didn't care who bought it. I just wanted it out of my name. Sometimes, though, when I lie awake at night, I hear the sound of slow, steady breathing in the dark, and I know it isn't in my head. It's the memory of being out there, alone with someone who was too close. That cabin rots deeper into the woods now, probably still standing, probably still waiting for the next fool who thinks a little isolation sounds like peace. But I know better. Silence out there isn't peace. It's someone waiting, listening, just outside the door. I had always liked the idea of being far from people, far from traffic and phones and endless noise. That was part of the reason I bought the old cabin in northern Minnesota back in 2009. It sat off a logging road that hadn't seen fresh gravel in years, about an hour north of Grand Rapids. The nearest neighbor was a retired teacher about 3 miles down the ridge, and even he wasn't around much in the colder months. The cabin wasn't much. 2 rooms, a wood stove, and a porch that sagged to the east. but it was enough for me and my dog, Buck. He was a big German Shepherd mix, about 5 years old at the time, with the kind of sharp ears that always seemed to be listening to something I couldn't hear. That was comforting most days. On others, it wasn't. It was early November, not yet winter deep, but cold enough that the air stung the lungs if you stepped outside at night. That night, the rain had been coming down steady since late afternoon. Not a storm with thunder, just that endless wet sound that presses against the roof and keeps you aware of the dark outside. The forest smells stronger in the rain, like wet pine needles and mud, and the way the cabin walls creaked in the damp made me feel the weight of the woods pressing close. I had a fire going in the stove, and Buck was lying by it, eyes half closed, ears twitching every so often. I had a lantern lit on the table, and I sat with an old book open in front of me, though I wasn't really reading. The rain had a way of dragging thoughts out, and I was more watching the shadows shift on the walls than paying attention to the words. At first, it was just the usual noises, the hiss of the fire, the rain tapping, Buck's breathing. Then Buck's head lifted. His ears went straight, and his eyes moved toward the front door. He didn't growl, not yet, just watched. I froze without meaning to, the way you do when someone else picks up on something before you. I turned my head toward the door too, listening. At first, I thought maybe it was just the rain shifting, or a tree dripping heavy drops onto the porch. Then I heard it again, faint but sharp, the crunch of gravel. Not constant, not the sound of someone walking steady, but 1 or 2 steps, then silence. I told myself it could have been a branch falling or an animal. The woods were full of deer, bears too, though they usually kept clear once the weather turned this cold. But Buck was standing now, muscles tense, tail low, that low rumble starting in his chest. He knew the difference between a rabbit moving through brush and something heavier. The steps didn't come closer, but I could hear a shift, like weight shifting on the old boards of the porch. A long pause, then another creak. Whoever or whatever it was out there, standing not more than a few feet from the door. The cabin had no lock. It was the kind of place people only used seasonally, and I'd never thought much of it. Most folks didn't come all the way out here unless they were hunting, and even then, they had their own places. That night, though, the fact that the door was just a wooden latch with no real strength in it hit me like a stone in the gut. I stayed still for a long time, every sense straining. Buck was right at the door now, nose down near the bottom edge, growling low but steady. Rain dripped from the eaves, and between that and the fire crackling, I couldn't pick out much else. Then, out of nowhere, came 3 hard knocks. Not loud, not frantic, but solid. One after another. Then silence again. My whole body went cold. My first thought was to grab the rifle I kept by the bed in the other room. I moved slow, trying not to let the floor creak under me. Buck didn't move from the door. His growl was constant now, his hackles raised. I pulled the rifle from its rack and held it tight, not pointing, just holding. Minutes passed. The knocking didn't come again. Whoever had been there wasn't announcing themselves anymore. If that's what the knocks had even been for. I thought maybe they'd walked off. Maybe it had been some drunk hunter, though that didn't sit right either. The steps I'd heard were careful, not stumbling. I waited nearly half an hour before I let myself move back toward the table. Buck finally sat, but he didn't lie down. His eyes stayed locked on the door, ears twitching at every drip outside. When I finally went to the window by the stove, I lifted the curtain just an inch to peek out. It was black out there. No porch light, no yard light, just the rain, the faint line of the treeline, and the kind of thick dark that swallows detail. I saw nothing, but I felt watched, that prickling weight on the back of the neck you can't shake. I didn't sleep much the rest of the night. I sat in the chair with the rifle across my lap, Buck at my feet. I must have drifted off sometime near dawn, because I remember opening my eyes to pale gray light and realizing the rain had stopped. The first thing I did was open the door and step onto the porch. The air was sharp with that clean smell after rain, and the world was quiet. I looked down, and that's when I saw them, boot prints, fresh, deep from the rain-soaked ground. They came up the gravel drive, across the yard, up the steps, and stopped at my door. No turn, no retreat, just stopped. I followed the prints back down, out past the drive, expecting to see them continue toward the road. But 50 yards out, they just cut into the woods, swallowed by brush and pine needles. Whoever had been there hadn't come for help or shelter. They had come up to the door, stood there long enough to knock, then gone off into the woods in the rain. I never found out who it was. I asked the retired teacher weeks later if anyone had been roaming around, and he hadn't heard a thing. Nobody else came by to say they'd been lost or looking for something. What stuck with me more than anything was the silence after those knocks. The way they didn't say a word, didn't call out, didn't try to explain. Just stood there, knowing someone was inside. That winter, I bought heavy locks for the door and reinforced the frame. I put bars across the windows too. Some nights, especially when the rain comes steady and the woods press close, I still find myself looking at the door, waiting for the sound of boots on the porch. And every time I do, Buck, older now, still lifts his head the same way he did that night. His ears twitch, his eyes narrow, and for a moment, it all feels like it never ended. I was 32 when I decided to spend a week alone in a rented cabin deep in the woods of northern Michigan. It was the fall of 2014, early October, when the air was cold enough to bite but not yet filled with snow. The trees were already turning red and orange, and the dirt road leading to the cabin looked like it hadn't seen much traffic in months. The place had been listed online, owned by some older couple who mostly used it in the summer. They left the keys in a lockbox and warned me through email that cell service out there was weak at best. That didn't bother me. In fact, that was the point. I wanted quiet, no distractions, just time away from work and the constant pressure of city life. The cabin itself wasn't large. It was one floor made of dark, weathered logs with a tin roof and a small porch facing the tree line. Inside, it smelled faintly of wood smoke and damp earth. There was no television, no internet, just a small kitchen, a wood stove for heat, and a single bedroom with a thin mattress. I had brought books, a journal, and enough food to last me the week. At first, the silence felt refreshing. No car horns, no chatter, no buzzing notifications. Just the wind moving through the trees and the occasional sound of birds. The first 2 days went smoothly. I hiked during the mornings, followed deer trails through the woods, then came back to cook simple meals on the gas stove. At night, I read by the light of a small lamp, listening to the wood crackle in the stove. The quiet pressed in around me, but it was a comfortable quiet. I even slept better than I had in months. It wasn't until the third night that I noticed something that put me on edge. Around midnight, I woke up needing to use the bathroom. The cabin had running water, but the toilet was in a small room at the back. When I walked down the hall, I caught a glimpse through the front window. Out in the yard, near the edge of the trees, I thought I saw movement. It was too dark to make out details, but something pale shifted against the black tree trunks. At first, I told myself it was a deer. They were everywhere in those woods. But when I stood there, watching, I realized it wasn't moving like an animal. It was still, too still, like someone standing and waiting. I told myself I was imagining things. Maybe I was still half asleep. Maybe it was just the shape of the trees. I forced myself to look away, finish in the bathroom, and go back to bed. But my sleep was broken the rest of the night. Every sound outside made me sit up, listening. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling. On my morning hike, I kept checking behind me, convinced I was being followed. The woods felt different, heavier, as if I was no longer alone. I cut the hike short and went back to the cabin, locking the door behind me even though it had seemed unnecessary before. That night, it escalated. I was writing in my journal when I heard the crunch of leaves outside the cabin. Not random rustling from an animal, but slow, steady steps. My hand froze over the page. I turned off the lamp and sat in the dark, listening. The footsteps circled the cabin. They were deliberate, moving from one side to the other. I held my breath, my heart slamming in my chest. There was no knock, no voice, just the sound of someone walking just beyond the thin log walls. After what felt like forever, the sound faded. I stayed awake until dawn, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. In the morning, I went outside carefully. The air was cold and still. Around the cabin, in the damp earth and scattered leaves, I saw them, footprints. They weren't mine. These were larger, heavier, pressed deep into the ground. Whoever had been out there had walked close to the porch, then back into the woods. I felt sick realizing I hadn't imagined it. Someone had been circling me while I sat alone inside. I wanted to leave right then, but the cabin was nearly 2 hours from the nearest small town, and the dirt road was rough. I tried calling for help, but as warned, there was no signal. I told myself maybe it was just a hunter, maybe they were lost. Still, I couldn't calm down. I kept the axe I had brought for chopping wood next to me the whole day. That night was worse. Around the same time as before, I heard the footsteps again. This time they didn't circle. They stopped at the porch. I could hear the old wooden boards creak under the weight. Then came a long silence. I sat on the floor of the bedroom, back against the bed, every muscle tight. The doorknob rattled. Just a quick testing shake. My throat went dry. I was certain they were going to break in, but after a few seconds, the sound stopped. Eventually, the footsteps retreated into the woods. I didn't sleep at all. When daylight came, I made up my mind to leave. I packed my things quickly, loaded my car, and started down the dirt road. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel. The forest on both sides seemed endless, pressing closer. After about 15 minutes of driving, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. In the soft mud of the road ahead were fresh tire tracks that weren't mine. The road was so remote that no one should have been out there. I followed the tracks slowly, scanning the trees, half expecting someone to step out. A mile later, I came around a bend and saw it. A pickup truck pulled off to the side of the road, dark green, old, rust around the edges. The windows were tinted too dark to see inside. My first instinct was to stop and ask for help, but everything in me screamed not to. The way it was parked, angled slightly toward the road as if waiting, felt wrong. I drove past without slowing, eyes fixed ahead, not daring to look at the truck again. The rest of the drive felt endless. I kept checking the mirror, convinced I would see headlights behind me, but the road stayed empty. Finally, after nearly an hour, my phone buzzed back to life with signal. I didn't call anyone right away. I just drove straight into town, parked at a gas station, and sat there breathing hard, the weight finally lifting now that I was around people again. I never went back to that cabin. I didn't even contact the owners about what had happened. Part of me thought maybe it was nothing. Maybe I had overreacted. But I know what I heard, what I saw. Someone had been out there watching me, testing the door, waiting. If I had stayed one more night, I don't think I would have made it out. That thought still creeps into my head whenever I find myself in a quiet place, far from other people. The woods don't feel peaceful to me anymore. They feel like a place where someone can disappear without a trace. I had been living in the city my whole life, so when a friend of mine offered me his family's old cabin in northern Minnesota for a week, I thought it would be the perfect way to escape noise, traffic, and constant crowds. It was late October of 1997. the kind of season when the air turned sharp and dry, and the woods grew quieter with every passing day. I was 29 years old then, tired from work, and thought a week away from everything would clear my head. I drove up in my old Ford, about 5 hours from Minneapolis, into stretches of road that became narrower, lonelier, and finally turned into gravel paths buried in tall pines and leafless birch. The cabin sat about half a mile off the main dirt road, down a trail I barely noticed at first. The trees closed in overhead so tight it felt like driving through a tunnel. When I finally reached the clearing, the cabin stood there, small, weathered, and plain. It wasn't one of those postcard log cabins with bright varnished wood. This one looked tired, gray boards with peeling paint, a tin roof that showed rust, and a crooked chimney. The front porch sagged a little in the middle. A single window faced the clearing. It looked empty, but not abandoned. Inside, it smelled like old wood and dust. There was a stone fireplace on the far wall, 2 chairs, a short table, and a narrow bed against the corner. The mattress felt lumpy when I pressed down, but I wasn't expecting comfort out here. I unpacked a bag of clothes, a few canned meals, and the hunting knife I always carried when camping. There was no running water, just an old hand pump outside. No electricity either, except a little gas lantern left behind. The first day was calm. I chopped some wood, swept out the cobwebs, and walked down to the edge of a lake about a quarter-mile away. The lake was wide and still, the surface dark like a mirror. Not another person in sight. The silence felt strange but good. I remember sitting there until the sun slid down and the cold crept up my arms. That night, lying on the bed with the lantern off, the silence was heavier than I imagined. In the city, you never get real silence. Out here, it pressed in on me. I heard every groan of the wood, every pop from the fireplace, and once what sounded like movement outside. I told myself it was a deer. The second day, I decided to hike deeper into the woods. The trees were so thick in places I had to push branches out of my face. The ground was covered in dead leaves, and I could hear my own footsteps echo far. I walked maybe 2 miles and didn't see a soul. No cabins, no tire tracks, nothing. But I did find something strange. It was a pile of bones, small ones, maybe from a deer or a dog, stacked almost neatly against a tree. The skull was missing, but the ribcage had been laid across the pile like someone arranged it. I stared at it longer than I should have, then told myself it was some hunter who butchered an animal and left scraps for scavengers. Still, the way it was stacked didn't feel random. It felt deliberate. I walked back faster than I came. That evening, I sat on the porch as the sun went down. The woods were blacker than I expected, like they swallowed the last bit of light. Somewhere out there, I thought I heard footsteps again. Not fast, not close, just the faint crunch of leaves under weight. When I stood up, it stopped. The third night was worse. I woke around 2 in the morning. The fire had gone out, and the cabin was freezing. But what pulled me awake was a sound at the window. It wasn't a knock exactly. It was softer, like something brushing against the glass. I lay still, staring at the ceiling, trying not to breathe too loud. The sound came again, longer this time, a drag of something against glass. I finally forced myself to sit up, but when I looked, the window was just black. No shape, no reflection, nothing. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. By morning, I convinced myself I had imagined it. But when I stepped outside, I saw it, boot prints in the dirt leading right up to the porch. Not mine. Too big, spaced differently. They came from the tree line, stopped at the porch, then turned back the way they came. No tire tracks, no sign of a truck. Just prints. I tried not to panic. People hunt out here. Maybe someone just wandered close. But I couldn't shake the thought of them standing there in the dark, looking at the window while I slept inside. I almost packed my things that morning, but I told myself I'd tough it out. It was only a week. That day, I barely left the cabin. I kept checking the woods, staring at the tree line every few minutes. I thought I saw movement a couple times, just quick flashes between the trunks, but it could have been my nerves. I locked the cabin door early, even though the flimsy lock wouldn't stop anyone determined. That night was the longest of my life. Around midnight, the footsteps came back. This time I didn't pretend. They were slow, circling the cabin. I could hear the crunch of leaves, then silence, then the faint thud of a step again. Whoever it was took their time, like they wanted me to hear. My heart was hammering so hard it drowned out my breath. I gripped the hunting knife tight, sitting in the chair facing the door, every lantern blown out so I wouldn't be visible through the glass. The steps stopped. For nearly an hour, nothing. I thought maybe they left. Then the sound came from the back of the cabin. A scrape against the wall, deliberate, slow. I imagined someone dragging a stick or a knife along the wood. I wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go in that darkness. I stayed like that until the first light seeped into the cracks of the window. The sounds had stopped long before, but I didn't move until daylight was solid. When I finally opened the door, the ground was damp with frost, and the prints were there again. Clearer this time, heavy boots circling the cabin. At the back wall, I found scratches gouged into the wood, deep and straight, too high for an animal. I didn't pack slowly this time. I threw my bag into the truck, didn't even bother folding the blanket on the bed. I drove down that narrow trail so fast I almost tore off the side mirror on a tree. When I hit the gravel road, I didn't stop. By the time I reached the highway, the sun was high, and I told myself I was safe. But the whole drive back, I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see a truck following me, or someone sitting in the back seat. I never went back to that cabin. My friend asked me later how it was, and I lied, said it was fine, peaceful even. I couldn't explain what happened without sounding paranoid. But the truth is burned into me. Someone was out there. They knew I was alone. They circled that cabin at night, and they wanted me to know it. I don't know what would have happened if I had stayed one more night, and I'm not sure I ever want to. I was 31 years old in the summer of 2004 when I took a trip out to northern Minnesota, not far from the Canadian border. I had been working long hours at a warehouse job in Duluth and needed a break. A friend of mine told me about a small cabin that his uncle used to hunt from, deep in the woods near a remote lake. He said no one had been out there in years, but the structure was still standing. That was enough for me. I had grown tired of noise, tired of people, and thought a week alone in the woods might clear my head. The drive took most of the day. Once I left the main highway, the roads turned to gravel, then dirt, then finally narrowed into two ruts barely wide enough for my pickup. Tall pines leaned over the path, blocking out the sun. My phone lost service 20 minutes before I reached the cabin, and by then it felt like I had left the world behind. When I finally pulled up, the cabin looked rough but sturdy. The wood was gray from weather, the roof sagged a little, but the door still held firm. Inside was a single room with an old cot, a wood stove, and shelves lined with dust. Spider webs clung to the corners, and the smell was a mix of mold and pine sap. It wasn't cozy, but I hadn't come for comfort. I set down my cooler, sleeping bag, and a lantern, then went out back to see the lake. The water stretched wide and dark, with no houses, no docks, nothing but trees on every side. I didn't even see a boat. The air was still, the only sound the high, thin call of a loon far across the water. I stood there for a while, just breathing, thinking this was exactly what I needed. That first night passed quietly. I built a fire outside, cooked some canned chili, and sat listening to the crack of branches in the woods. By 9, the sky was already black, so I went inside, locked the door, and laid on the cot. The silence was heavy, almost pressing against my ears. At some point, I drifted to sleep. The second night is when I noticed something odd. I had been hiking during the day, following deer trails and carrying a small pack with water and a sandwich. When I got back to the cabin, I saw boot prints in the dirt near the door. They weren't mine. Mine were wide-soled work boots with thick tread, but these were narrower, smoother, like an older style. The tracks led up to the door, paused there, then turned and walked back into the woods. At first I told myself it could have been old, maybe from when my friend's uncle last stayed here. But the dirt had been soft from rain 2 days earlier, and the edges were sharp, not washed out. Whoever made them had been there recently. That night, I kept the lantern burning longer. Every time the flame flickered, I found myself looking toward the door, listening for footsteps. The woods are never fully quiet, but when midnight came, it felt different. The crickets stopped, the breeze died, and the only sound was the steady hum in my own ears. I didn't sleep much. The third day, I went farther down the lake, carrying a fishing rod. I thought maybe if I kept busy, I wouldn't dwell on the tracks. Around noon, I noticed a broken branch along the trail, bent at shoulder height. Not snapped clean like a storm would do, but bent down like someone had grabbed it. I kept moving, telling myself it was nothing. But when I returned later, I found another set of prints, fresh, near the waterline. They looked like the same boots as before. I started to feel watched. Every rustle in the brush made me turn my head. By the time I got back to the cabin, I was sweating even though the air was cool. I checked the door, still locked. I checked inside, nothing moved. But the thought of being out there alone with someone nearby gnawed at me. That night, I built the fire larger, feeding it with branches until the flames stood tall. I dragged my cooler and supplies inside, locked the door, and set the lantern on the table. I sat there for hours listening. At one point, just past midnight, I heard something out back. Not an animal crashing through the woods, but the slow crunch of a footstep. Then another, then silence. I didn't move. My hands were tight on the edge of the cot. I stared at the door, waiting for the handle to turn, but nothing came. After maybe 10 minutes, the sound drifted away. I stayed awake till dawn, every muscle tense. The fourth day, I thought about leaving. My truck was still there, gas half full, but part of me didn't want to run. I told myself I was being paranoid. Still, I packed most of my gear in case I decided to drive out. Before I left, I walked a slow circle around the cabin. That's when I found it. Behind the tree line, maybe 40 yards out, there was a spot where the grass had been pressed down. In the middle lay a cigarette, but the filter yellow, the paper damp. I don't smoke, and I hadn't seen another person since arriving. Whoever was out there had been close enough to watch me. That night, I didn't light a fire. I didn't want to make myself a target. I kept the lantern low and sat with my back against the wall, shotgun across my lap. Hours passed, slow and heavy. Then I heard it again. A step, a pause, another step. This time it came right up to the wall of the cabin. I could hear the weight shift, boards creaking as if someone leaned against the outer wall. My throat was dry, my heart hammering so loud I thought it might give me away. Then came the sound of fingernails dragging lightly across the wood, just beside the window. A long, slow scrape. I stayed frozen, breathing shallow. The scraping stopped. After a while, I heard retreating steps, then nothing. I waited until morning, every minute crawling. As soon as light broke, I threw everything into my truck and drove out fast, the branches slapping against the doors as I tore down the path. I didn't stop until I reached the highway. When I got back to Duluth, I told myself not to mention it. What could I say? That someone walked around an old cabin while I was there? That I heard noises in the night? No one would believe it was serious. But I knew what I saw, the fresh tracks, the cigarette, the sound of fingers on the wall. Someone had been out there. They had watched me, followed me, crept right up to the cabin in the dark. I never went back. To this day, I can't stand the silence of deep woods. People think the scary part of the wilderness is bears or wolves, but they're wrong. The real fear comes from knowing another person might be out there, hidden in the trees, waiting. I was 28 when I decided to spend a few weeks alone in a small rental cabin outside Flagstaff, Arizona. It was the fall of 1999, and I had been working nonstop at my construction job. I needed to get away from the constant noise of the city, so I rented this place from a guy who lived about 20 miles down the mountain road. The cabin wasn't fancy, just 2 rooms with a wood stove, no television, and barely enough electricity to run a couple of lamps. That was fine with me. I wanted the silence. The first few days went as planned. I split firewood in the morning, walked the trails that twisted through the pines, and cooked simple meals at night. The nights were colder than I expected, so I kept the fire going long past midnight. I didn't mind the creaks of the cabin settling or the occasional scrape of tree branches against the roof. I told myself those were the normal sounds of the woods. By the 4th night, I started to notice something odd. Around midnight, I heard what sounded like footsteps outside the cabin. Not heavy, not rushing, just slow, steady crunches of pine needles. I froze, sitting on the edge of my bed, listening. The steps stopped when I held my breath. After a long pause, I told myself it was probably an elk or maybe a stray dog sniffing around. I lay back down, but sleep didn't come easy. The next morning, I went outside to check. The ground was hard-packed dirt mixed with needles and leaves, but I swear I saw a few footprints near the back corner of the cabin. They were faint, like someone barefoot had stepped in the cold dirt, but the shape didn't look quite right. The heel looked long, the toes uneven, stretched somehow. I stared at them for a while, my stomach turning a little. In the daylight, it was easier to brush it off. Maybe they weren't even prints, just weird patches of ground. That night, the noise came again. I had been sitting in the single chair by the fire, reading, when I heard it, slow crunching steps circling the cabin. This time, it was steady, deliberate, as if whoever it was didn't care if I heard. The steps circled twice before stopping near the front wall. Then silence. I didn't move. I sat so still that my neck ached, my hand clenching the book so tight the pages crumpled. After what felt like an hour, I finally worked up the nerve to look through the window. Nothing, just black trees, still and quiet. The next morning, I noticed more of those odd tracks, this time clearer. They went from the tree line to the edge of the cabin and back again. The length of the stride seemed wrong, stretched farther than normal. It was like someone had been trying to walk like a human but didn't quite know how. The 5th night was worse. I had just put out the lantern when I heard it again, only this time closer. The steps weren't cautious. They dragged, uneven, as though something walked on unfamiliar legs. I pulled the blanket up to my chin, listening, my heart hammering so hard I thought it would echo off the cabin walls. Then, the sound of breathing came through the thin wood wall, low, raspy, not like an animal, but not quite human either. I didn't move the rest of the night. I stayed frozen, waiting for the door to creak open, but it never did. When daylight finally came, I stepped outside with the axe I used for firewood gripped tight in my hand. The tracks were everywhere now, circling the cabin again and again. Some were pressed so deep into the dirt they had to belong to something heavy. I thought about leaving, packing up right then, but the idea of walking down that long, empty road alone made my skin crawl. I told myself I'd wait until morning, when the sun was bright and high. The 6th night was the one that broke me. I tried to sleep early, but the noises began just after dusk. First, the footsteps, then something scratching against the side of the cabin. Not claws, but fingers. Long, dragging strokes along the wall. The sound slid across the wood like nails on a chalkboard. I sat in the dark, my body rigid, axe across my lap. Hours passed with the sound circling. Then something tapped against the glass window. Once, twice, slow and deliberate. I couldn't bring myself to look. My breathing was shallow, each inhale trembling. The tapping stopped, but the breathing returned, this time closer. It was right outside, just feet from where I sat, separated only by thin planks of pine. I stayed like that until dawn. When the light broke through, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my bag, stuffed what I could inside, and left. I didn't care about the food I left behind or the tools. I walked straight down the dirt road until my legs felt like they'd give out. It took me 3 hours to reach the nearest gas station. The clerk stared at me like I was crazy, drenched in sweat, pale, and shaking. I didn't explain. I just asked him to call a cab to take me back into town. Later, when I told the cabin's owner what happened, he didn't look surprised. He just nodded, told me others had left early before, and that sometimes things in the woods weren't what they seemed. That was all he said. Years later, I still think about those nights. I've tried to explain it logically. Maybe it was some stranger messing with me, maybe a drifter who knew the woods better than I did. The prints could have been deformed from the uneven ground. The breathing, just my imagination. That's what I tell myself when I wake up at night replaying the sound of those dragging footsteps outside my door. But the truth is, I don't really know. I never went back to that cabin, never set foot in those woods again. Every so often, though, I dream about it. The sound of those long, uneven steps circling in the dark. The slow tap on the glass. The breathing that didn't belong to any person I've ever known. And what unsettles me most is that I left in daylight, but whatever it was never tried to stop me. As if it knew it had all the nights in the world to follow me if it wanted. I was 32, and I never thought I'd be someone who'd take up a cabin in the middle of nowhere. But there I was. It was January, cold and wet, and the sky hung low, dark clouds threatening snow. I had booked this weekend getaway as a break from the noise of city life. The cabin was in the middle of a wooded area in the Lake District, UK. I was hoping for peace, solitude, a place where I could clear my head after the long weeks of work and stress. The place was small, built from rough-hewn stone with a thatched roof, nestled on the edge of a forest. It wasn't fancy, just the basics. A small wood stove, a couple of armchairs, a bed with thick blankets, and a small kitchen. Outside, there was only the dark expanse of trees, the wind sighing through them. It felt like I was the only person in the world. I arrived late in the afternoon, the last rays of daylight cutting through the trees. The cabin had no electricity, just a few solar-powered lamps, so after the sun went down, it would be pitch black. I didn't mind though, it was part of the charm. After unpacking, I set up a fire in the stove and made myself a simple dinner of pasta and bread. The warmth of the fire made the cold outside seem like a distant memory. That night, I sat by the fire reading a book. I was about halfway through, feeling oddly comfortable in my isolation. But then, something caught my attention, a faint rustling outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but it was too rhythmic, too deliberate. My heart skipped a beat. I stood up, looking out through the small window above the sink. The trees were thick and impenetrable, shadows weaving in the moonlight, but there was no one there. I laughed it off, blaming the solitude getting to my head. I returned to my book and tried to ignore the feeling that something was off. Maybe it was the isolation getting to me, but I couldn't shake the unease. Hours passed, and the wind outside began to pick up, whistling through the cracks in the walls. I eventually turned in for the night, the fire still flickering low in the stove. The cabin creaked with every gust of wind. I tried to get comfortable in the bed, but the unease wouldn't leave. It was too quiet. No animals, no sounds of life, just the wind and the occasional snap of a branch. Around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by a sharp noise, like a tap against the window. I froze, my mind racing. I couldn't see anything through the fogged-up glass. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate. It sounded like it was coming from the side of the cabin, just beyond my line of sight. A chill ran down my spine. It wasn't the wind. It was something else. I got up cautiously, tiptoeing to the window. The night was pitch black outside, the moon barely cutting through the trees. I didn't see anything, but the tapping continued, now moving around the cabin as if someone, or something, was walking along the walls. My heart was hammering in my chest as I backed away from the window. I grabbed a flashlight from my bag, but as soon as I clicked it on, the tapping stopped. The sudden silence was deafening. I stood there for a moment, staring at the door, unsure whether to investigate or hide. I decided to take a look. I pulled on my coat, grabbed the flashlight, and stepped outside. The cold hit me instantly, biting through my clothes. The wind howled through the trees, and the ground was slick with frost. I shined the light around the cabin, but there was no sign of anything unusual. No footprints in the snow. Nothing. But then, as I was about to head back inside, I saw her, a woman, standing just beyond the tree line, almost completely obscured by the darkness. She was wearing a long, dark coat, her face hidden by a hood. I couldn't make out her features, but there was something about the way she stood, still unmoving, that sent a cold shiver through me. For a moment, I just stared, unsure of what to do. The flashlight shook in my hand, and the wind made it hard to focus. Then the woman took a step forward. Slowly, deliberately. She didn't speak, didn't make a sound, but I could feel her presence like a weight pressing against my chest. I quickly stepped back into the cabin, locking the door behind me. I leaned against the wooden walls, trying to catch my breath. My mind raced. Was she lost? A hiker or some local out for a walk? But something felt wrong. The way she moved, it was too unnatural, too slow, too deliberate. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed by the window, watching the darkness, half expecting her to appear again. But she didn't. The tapping never returned either. By morning, the cabin was still, and I convinced myself I had imagined it all. I chalked it up to stress, to too much time alone in the woods. But that wasn't the end of it. Over the next few days, the feeling of being watched lingered. I'd go for walks in the woods, trying to shake off the weird sense of unease, but I always felt like someone was behind me, just out of sight. I kept hearing footsteps in the leaves, just out of earshot, like someone was following me. Every time I stopped and looked around, nothing was there. On the third day, I was returning from a walk when I noticed something strange. The door to the cabin was slightly ajar. I was sure I had locked it before I left. My heart skipped a beat as I approached. I reached for the door, my hand trembling. When I pushed it open, I was met with the smell of damp earth and something else. Something sweet, almost sickly. The kind of scent you get when something has been left to rot. Inside, nothing had been disturbed, but there, on the floor near the stove, was something that made my blood run cold. A small, perfectly folded scarf. It was the same dark color as the woman's coat, and it was folded exactly like something you would do after a long day. My stomach twisted as I realized that she had been inside. Not just outside, but inside my cabin. She had been here. I packed up immediately and left the next morning. I didn't care that I had paid for a week's stay. I couldn't stay another night. As I drove away, I couldn't help but wonder who that woman was. Had she been a hiker, a local, or had she been watching me the whole time, waiting for something? I never found out. I've never been back to that cabin. But every time I think about it, I still remember that face or lack of one. The memory of those eyes staring at me from the shadows, cold and unblinking. I don't know if it was just my mind playing tricks, but I'll never forget the feeling that someone or something was always watching. I was 34 the fall I decided to spend a week alone in the northern woods of Minnesota. I'd hunted before, but never truly by myself for more than a night or two. A friend of mine knew an old cabin on a patch of land his uncle used to own, and he told me I could use it if I wanted. The cabin wasn't much more than 4 walls, a roof, and a wood stove, but to me it sounded perfect. I wanted quiet, time away from people, and a chance to put myself in the middle of nothing but trees, cold air, and the crunch of leaves under boots. I left early on a Tuesday in late October of 2016, driving north until the paved roads narrowed into gravel and finally ended. From there, it was another half-mile on foot with all my gear. I carried a pack heavy with food, clothes, a small first aid kit, my rifle, a hatchet, and a sleeping bag. The walk wasn't easy, but when I reached the cabin, I felt a wave of relief. The cabin was what I expected. Rough logs stacked together, the wood darkened with age. The roof sagged a little in the middle, and one of the shutters banged lightly in the breeze, but it looked like it would hold through the week. Inside, there was a table, 2 old chairs, a narrow bed frame without a mattress, and the stove with a rusty pipe that went straight up through the roof. The smell of old wood and mice was strong, but it was still better than sleeping under a tarp. The first 2 days passed quietly. I woke early, made coffee on the little propane burner I brought, and sat on the steps with steam rising into the frosty air. I hunted during the day, not seeing much beyond a few deer too far for a clean shot. At night, I chopped wood, kept a fire going in the stove, and listened to the stillness press against the cabin walls. It was lonely, but in a way I enjoyed. It was on the 3rd night that I started to feel something change. The wind had picked up, sharp and restless. The cabin creaked as if it was shifting with every gust. I lay in my sleeping bag on the wooden frame, trying to drift off, when I heard a noise that didn't belong to the woods. It was faint, like something brushing against the outside wall. At first, I told myself it was just a branch, maybe loosened by the wind. But then it came again, a dragging sound, slow and deliberate. I held my breath. My rifle leaned against the table, close but not close enough if I needed it quickly. The dragging sound stopped after a few minutes, and I stayed awake until my eyes finally gave up. The next morning, I walked around the cabin. The ground was covered in wet leaves, pressed down from the night's rain. On the far side, near the back wall, I noticed a line in the dirt where something had been moved or pulled. It was a shallow groove winding off into the trees. I crouched, ran my glove over it, and felt a cold unease settle in. Maybe it was nothing, an animal, a log that shifted, but the line was too straight, too steady, as if something heavy had been dragged by human hands. The day passed without trouble, but I couldn't shake it. I hunted for a while but didn't wander far. When the sun dipped, I forced myself to stay calm, telling myself I was imagining things. That night, I built the fire hotter than usual, the flames rattling the stove as sparks popped. I kept the lantern burning on the table too, even though the fuel was limited. Around midnight, the sound came back. Not dragging this time, but footsteps. Slow, steady crunches in the leaves outside. My body locked. I knew the rhythm. It wasn't an animal. It was a person. The steps circled the cabin, pausing every so often. My heart hammered so loud I thought whoever was out there would hear it. I gripped the rifle tight, not pointing it, but holding it across my chest. The steps stopped at the front door. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. Whoever it was just stood there. I stared at the door, every muscle stiff, waiting for it to push open. It never did. After what felt like hours, the steps moved again, fading into the woods. I didn't sleep at all. When dawn came, I went outside carefully, rifle slung over my shoulder. The ground was damp again, and the prints were there. Clear, boot prints circling the cabin. Not mine. They were larger and deeper, someone heavier. I followed them for a short distance into the trees, but stopped. My chest tightened at the thought of running into whoever it was alone out there. I turned back. The rest of the day was miserable. Every sound in the woods made me spin. I tried to focus on hunting but gave up quickly. By evening, I knew I couldn't stay another night. Something wasn't right. I packed what I could before dark, stuffing everything back into my pack, leaving behind small things I didn't need. I planned to leave first light. Still, I had to get through one more night in the cabin. I kept the lantern burning again, even though it hissed low with the last of the fuel. I sat in the chair with the rifle across my lap, waiting. The woods outside felt alive, pressing in on me. Hours crawled by until finally the sound returned. This time, the steps were faster, less careful. They came right up to the door and stopped. The handle rattled. My throat went dry. The door held. An old iron latch was the only thing keeping it shut. Whoever was outside pressed against it once, twice, the wood groaning. Then silence. I sat frozen, gun ready, my breath fogging in the cold air of the cabin. The minutes dragged, but I didn't hear footsteps leaving. That was somehow worse. The lantern died out around 3 in the morning. I sat in the dark, clutching the rifle, my ears straining for every sound. When the first pale light touched the cracks of the shutter, I grabbed my pack, swung it over my shoulder, and left. I didn't even bother to check outside before I went. I just pushed the door open, rifle up, and walked fast toward the trail that led back to the road. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. My boots pounded the ground until I saw the dull shine of my truck through the trees. I tossed the pack in, started the engine, and drove without thinking until the road widened and the woods thinned behind me. I never went back to that cabin. I told my friend about it, but I left out most of the details. Maybe he thought I got spooked by being alone, but I knew what I heard, what I saw. Someone else was out there. They knew I was alone, and they came back more than once. Even now, years later, I still think about it when I'm in the woods. Hunting isn't the same anymore. It isn't the animals that make me tense, or the quiet. It's the thought that sometimes, when you think you're alone out there, you're not.